applause.
Morning, guys. How are you? Doing okay? Perfect. Listen, I think we're running a little bit behind, so we'll see how much I can get through before lunch, and then we'll continue afterwards, okay? So, thank you for coming today to my talk on toxic romance and tragic ends, teen relationships in Romeo and Juliet. I gotta admit something. I've never done this before. This is a brand new thing for me to think about how I'm going to talk about mental health and psychological topics related to a literature piece. Okay, so it's pretty unique and pretty cool for me to have this opportunity. I thank you so much for being present and being as focused as you can be. I was trying to think as I was preparing for this talk, I was trying to place myself in your shoes and how I would have felt if some random old guy was going to come talk to me in grade 9, and I had trouble trying to picture it. So again, all I'm saying is thank you for trying to pay attention as best as you can. You might be wondering who I am. So my name is Dr. Ed Roldan. I am a clinical and school psychologist. I used to be the psychologist here, actually. I used to work for the board. So for 9 years, I was in the school system, or 10 years in the school system, 9 years in this board, and I used to be the psychologist at this school. So I know the school well, I know the community well, and I'm very happy to be back. So what's my purpose of the talk today? What I'm hoping to do is to talk about topics within Romeo and Juliet that are relevant today, okay? And I believe there's one class who hasn't finished the reading yet, so I think there might be some spoilers today, so I apologize about that. But we're gonna be talking about some of the topics that come up in the story, including things like impulsivity, emotion regulation, emotion intensity, societal pressures. And we're going to try to talk about what are some things that we want to consider about being in healthy relationships versus toxic relationships. We're going to talk about how we can understand how intensity of emotions can get in the way of decision making. Okay? So, and also recognizing red flags. If you're in a relationship or want to enter a relationship, we're going to also talk about what are some things that might make a relationship toxic. So, a brief intro. Again, I'm assuming that you know the main themes in in Romeo and Juliet. I'm not going to be going like scene by scene or act by act. I'm not going to be going to individual scenes themselves because I'm assuming you know some of the things that occur. Okay, so what is Romeo and Juliet? It is the most famous love story in English literature. Okay, it has been around since the 1590s, and it's a story about love, passion, duty, honor, hate, right? And making really important choices in a rash manner, okay? So, what are some themes that we're gonna be talking about? We're gonna spend some time talking about this part of us, our brain, particularly geared towards you guys as teens. Okay, we're gonna talk about why Romeo and Juliet may have made some of their decisions that they made, and trying to reflect on how it might be similar to you in situations where you're feeling overwhelmed by emotions. We're then going to talk about identity development. You guys are currently in a phase of life where you are forming your identity based on your experiences. You're still at a stage where you decide the type of person you want to be. And that is how Romeo and Juliet were also in the story. If you think about it, here they were part of two families that were rivals, so they had the pressures of those two families, and yet they were trying to identify things that they wanted for themselves. Very similar to how you might be experiencing things in terms of what your family wants versus what you want. The third part is we're going to be talking about relationships themselves. Like I said, toxic relationships, what we want to consider if we are in a relationship to make sure it's healthy. And lastly, we're going to be talking about coping and connection. And really what I'm talking about is actually the lack of coping. The two characters really don't have very good coping skills. And so we're going to talk about that too. Okay? So, to get started on brain development. Have you guys ever heard have people ever said to you, teachers or parents, this aspect about the brain not fully developed in teens? Have you heard that before? Anyone? Yes? So it's true, right? So this part of the brain, this is called the frontal lobe. Okay, the frontal lobe doesn't finish developing until you're around 27. So think about it. You guys have like twice your age almost before you have this fully developed. And the reason this part of the brain is really important is because it's responsible for something called executive functions. Executive functions are a really funny name for a set of skills that are related to how we plan, how we organize, how we regulate our emotions, how we control our behavior so we're not impulsive, and very importantly, how we learn from mistakes. Okay? So within the Romeo and Juliet story, executive function is going to come in terms of their impulsivity, getting married really quickly, falling in love really quickly, making decisions really quickly. It's going to be about emotions and emotion regulation. So the intensity with which they fall in love with, the intensity of the hate between the two families, and then cognitive flexibility. Cognitive flexibility is the ability to adjust how you're thinking based on the scenario you're facing. When we are most activated, and we'll talk about this, when we're feeling an emotion really intensely, our focus tends to narrow. And that can cause problems because then we can start to be like in the story, us versus them, Montague versus Capulet. Okay? So the role of executive functioning in Romeo and Juliet, I just said it, but we'll repeat it. Okay, they fall in love, marry, and make really rash, life-altering and life-ending decisions. That's the spoiler alert. The intensity of their emotions is also related to their executive functioning. Again, they fall in love. They see no other options other than being with each other. And again, that the decision-making becomes really rigid in terms of us versus them. Right? So Mercutio deciding that he's going to fight Tybalt, all those type of things. It reflects how rigid their thinking was. Anyone know, I don't know if I have a feeling no one's going to want to answer, but what is an emotion before I turn? What is an emotion? Anyone willing to? Yes. Feelings? I can't hear you. I'm sorry, buddy. Something you feel. Great. Okay. So emotions are reactions to scenarios. They come up for us naturally. There's some cool things to think about emotions because when we work with teens at the clinic, so when teens come to work with us at the clinic, one of the main topics we talk about is our emotions. And the reason is society does a poor job of telling us what emotions are. Because society tells you that there are good emotions and there are bad emotions. And the reality is if you look at the last point, emotions are universal and they're human. There is no such thing as a bad emotion. Okay? And it is truly universal. They've done some cool studies where they take people from tribes of groups of people who live in the jungle who have never interacted with other sort of populations, and they experience the same basic emotions that we do. Okay, so they truly are universal. Now, the reason we talk about emotion when we work with teens is because emotions, rather than looking at them as good or bad, is we start to recognize that emotions identify a need. They tell you that something needs to happen. It gives you information about the environment, whether you feel unsafe in a scenario and you need to leave, whether you feel attacked in a scenario and you need to puff up and be angry to defend your boundaries, right? So emotions are important information. They provide important information. They also allow us to communicate with each other. How many times do you walk in a room and feel tension, right? How many times can a friend come to you and you know right away if they're in a good mood or in a bad mood? By knowing that, you adjust how you behave, right? So emotions are truly, truly important. So we're not going to try and say they shouldn't have been angry, they shouldn't have been in love. That's not the problem. The problem is the intensity of the emotion. Because in the story, what ends up happening is the characters are feeling an emotion so intensely that it's going to end up affecting how they make decisions. And there's a couple of reasons why you as teens and Romeo and Juliet, they're 16 and 13, I believe, right? The reason they're making decisions in a rash way and the reason they're having the intense emotions, there's a couple of reasons. One I already mentioned to you, it's biological, right? So part of this part of the brain isn't fully developed, but there's also another part of the brain called the amygdala that is actually pretty active during your teenage years. So the combination of having sort of the amygdala kicking in and having emotions with your poor sort of this part development is going to cause intense emotions for teens, okay? One thing that's important is to recognize that this can vary across individual kids, right? So if you think of some kids got a growth spurt and became tall from grade 8 to grade 9, other kids might have started puberty earlier or later. The same is true of executive functioning development. Some people are going to be more mature than others. The other thing that's really important, and we're going to come back to over and over in our talk, is the role of your social standing, the social environment that you belong to, and how those things can impact the intensity of your emotions. The pressures you feel with your family, the pressure you feel with your friends, the pressure you might feel about school or life decisions can also alter the intensity of your emotions. Can I ask, is a teacher able to give me a heads up when there's like almost lunch? Yep. Cool, thank you. So, what's the impact of intense emotions? In the story, the intense emotions impairs decision making. What it does is it gets in the way of proper decision making. It also leads to rigid thinking. So I want to give you an example. Let's say I'm walking down the street, right? And all of a sudden a dog is running at me and the dog looks angry. Okay, it looks like it's going to attack me. What do you think my focus is going to do in that moment? Anyone want to guess what's going to happen to my focus? Yes? I'm sorry? I can't hear, but it's okay. I'm just going to say it. So it's only going to focus on the dog. So when there's something like a threat, our brain is wired to look at only the threat. Okay? The same is true of any emotion. If I'm feeling an intense sense of fear or anger, my focus is going to get really specific, which can be really helpful, but it can also be problematic if, for example, I don't notice that there's a store next to me that I can run into because I'm focusing on the dog. And so instead of running into the store because my focus is so narrow, I might be like, oh my God, frozen, and I get attacked by the dog. And so in the scenario of the story, the characters get into a tunnel vision situation where it becomes us versus them, whether it becomes I can't see my life without being with Juliet, right? So their focus narrows in the story. I mentioned this, so us versus them, and then the other thing that's really interesting about the story is underneath the theme is that intense emotions, it doesn't matter the type of emotion, is problematic. So both love and hate are blinding in the story, right? If they have intense love, it's problematic, and intense hate is also problematic. So that's interesting for us to think about, okay? So part of the reason of me being here, though, is because I should be trying to guide you in terms of like how do we improve decision making. I just told you that your brain isn't fully formed and that other part of your brain is overly active and you're impacted by society and pressures. And so that sounds like bad news for you guys. My job is to try to make sense of how we can support you to make better decisions, okay? And so there's a couple of things. One of the most common things that I do when I'm working with teens is talk to them about knowing their compass points. What I mean by that is, imagine that you were lost in the middle of a forest. It's getting dark, it's night. I don't know why you're there in the forest, but let's just assume you're lost in the forest. You might start to feel overwhelmed. You might be terrified. You might start to think that you're not going to make it out of that forest. Now, imagine you had a compass. If you had a compass, the compass would be able to tell you where north is, for example. And let's say you knew where north was, then it would at least guide you out of that forest. The point is, when you find yourselves overwhelmed by a scenario, thinking that you're lost, that you don't have choices, one of the best ways to help you make the best decisions you can for yourself is to think about who and what matters to you. What type of person do you want to present to the world? And this is something I literally will talk to teens about in therapy, right? Like figuring out what you're about and trying to use that to guide you during different situations. Whether it's when peers are trying to get you to do something, whether it's your parents are trying to force you to do something, thinking about what it is that you want to move towards and trying to guide those decisions for you in that way. Another set of skills that we're going to talk about, and I talk to teens about all the time, is learning just to pause. Like literally pressing pause. Like I'm curious, like raise of hands. How many of you have gotten yourself into trouble by saying something back to a parent or an adult in some way? I feel like everyone, right? Like we all get into a situation where like we react and we don't think and we jump at something, right? So the ability and the capacity to be able to pause is something that I really try to work on teens so that they can develop it. Pause and notice. What I mean by notice is starting to ask yourself, for example, what am I really reacting to? I'll give you an example. Let's say, does anyone have like an annoying sibling? Okay, so imagine your annoying sibling is poking you and poking you and poking you. You're frustrated and frustrated. That sibling is annoying you. And then your parents ask you to do something, and you're so annoyed by your sibling that you like lose your temper on your parents, right? In that scenario, that example is, I want a teen to be able to develop like, am I really angry at my parent, or am I really annoyed about my sibling? And trying to decide that my interaction with my parents should not be impacted by my annoyance with my sibling. And that's a simple example. It can get much more complex, right? In life, you could be really stressed about your relationship, and it can impact your school. Or you're really stressed about school, and it's impacting your extracurriculars. So trying to develop the capacity to pause, notice, ask yourself, what am I really responding to, is going to be a skill that's going to bring you some more success. And then the other one, the last one that's crucial, is learning to walk away, especially when we're up here in emotions, right? If you think about it, like, can you imagine what would have happened if Mercutio walks away? What if Tybalt walks away? How would the story have played out if those characters were able to notice that they were furious or that they had to defend their honor, and then make a choice based on compass that says, well, it's not worth my time to do that, and walking away? The story would be very different, probably more boring, but you could see how by walking away, you're giving yourself options. Another thing to talk about in terms of emotions, I talked to you about like the emotions themselves aren't wrong. The intensity of emotion is what we want to focus on. And so part of what we're really discussing is regulating our emotions. Basically, emotion regulation is being able to adjust the intensity of your emotion so that the emotion is not controlling you. It's you learning to manage your emotions so that it doesn't control you. So how do we do that? A couple of things that we talk about when we're working with teens. One is the saying, name it to tame it, right? The more you can start to label things, I'm angry, I'm pissed, I'm scared, I'm whatever, it's going to start to tap into the part of your brain that thinks more, that stops and notices. It's also going to help you with communication, right? As soon as you're able to label an emotion, it's going to be able to communicate with a parent, with a friend, with a teacher, how you're feeling in that scenario. Another big one, I don't have time to go into too much detail, is a strategy called dropping an anchor. In the dropping anchor exercise, the idea is we teach teens to try to do something in a moment where they're feeling overwhelmed. So imagine I'm back in that lost forest, and I don't have a compass, and I'm starting to panic, and I'm starting to get overwhelmed. I might, in that moment, if I knew about it, drop an anchor. And the dropping anchor is basically 3 steps. The first step is to notice what I'm thinking, acknowledge what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling, and label it. The second step is to connect with your body in some way. So let me ask you, like, you know how, or I'm not going to ask because I can't hear, but like when you're scared, do you notice that your heart races? Do you notice you have butterflies in your stomach if you're nervous? Okay? Do you control those? The racing heart and the butterfly in your stomach, do you control those? No, they come up automatically. In the dropping anchor, the second step is to remember that we still have control over our bodies in those moments. So let's say I'm really nervous to talk to these amazing grade 9 students at St. Basil's, and I'm feeling really nervous, and I'm starting to get overwhelmed. I might remember, if I'm dropping an anchor, that I have control, and I can do things like pressing my fingers together. I might be, if I'm sitting down, I might be squeezing my thighs. I might notice that I can slow my breath. So first step is acknowledging, thinking about what you're thinking. Second step is finding a way to connect with your body under your control. And the last step is to engage in the moment with your senses. So it's doing things like pausing to notice sounds around you. It might be like, can I see how many green things are in the room? It might be playing with the case of my phone and touching it over and over. In that moment, if I'm using my senses, I can't help but be present. So the 3 steps are acknowledging your thoughts, connecting with your body in some way, using your senses to say, holy cow, I'm lost in the forest and I'm overwhelmed. By doing those steps, it's setting ourselves up to make the best decision I can in that scenario. Okay? And then the last one is a big one. I talk to teens all the time, is trying to develop the muscle of self-compassion. I don't know about you guys, but for most of the clients that we work with, Our voice in here is our worst critic, right? It could tell you what you're most self-conscious about. It can tell you what you're nervous about. It's going to tell you when you screw up. It's going to tell you you're the worst, right? And so developing the capacity to become a friend to yourself is a skill that I don't think we're taught. And so the ability to pause and say something like, this is really hard, I made a mistake, I'm trying my best, is better than trying to be really critical with yourself. So that's going to be a skill that we need to work on. What, I have like 5 minutes?
Yeah, 5 minutes. Maybe
4 minutes. Okay, guys. Okay, maybe I'll go really quickly here. I mentioned earlier, in high school, you're right now in grade 9, you're developing identity, right? Whether it is you came from a grade 8 school where you were the man in grade 8, and now you got at St. Basil's, and all of a sudden, oh man, maybe there's other guys who are, so you're adjusting, you're going through an adjustment period here. In the story, one of the things that's really important to focus on is, as teens, your social standing is evolution. From an evolutionary standpoint, how you fit in with your peers is actually what you should be worried about, okay? It's not wrong if you're worried about what other peers think about you. It's actually what we expect to occur. What happens though, and we're going to go into detail, is that you guys live in a time where you don't have a break from that. Every day when you're going on your socials and you're seeing what some other person's on a yacht and someone else is in a private plane and so is at a party that I wasn't invited to, you're constantly getting bombarded with how you measure up to your peers. So imagine, for example, in that scene where Tybalt tries to fight Romeo and Romeo doesn't engage, imagine everyone had their cell phones out and they were taping. Imagine now what Romeo might think in that scenario, like, well, people can't see that I wimped out of this fight, and it might change how his identity in that moment might change based on the social pressures that he's feeling. There's another component that I think I skipped before, is this idea of social comparison. Maybe I'll end with social comparison. Social comparison is the concept where we rate our worth based on how we compare to others on something that we care about. So an example would be, imagine that my parents had a nice Mustang, and I drove it to St. Basil's one day, and I'm blaring my music at the front of the school, and I'm in my Mustang feeling like all cool and stuff, and then someone comes around the corner and that person's in a Bentley. You know what's going to happen? Guy in a Mustang like this, feeling good, sees a Bentley, he's like, oh, gonna be embarrassed. So how we view something compared to our peers can impact how we identify ourselves and our worth. Something to pay attention when you're on your phone for hours on end. There's a lot of scientific evidence that suggests the more you spend time on social media comparing yourself to others, the worse you feel about yourselves. Okay? Yeah, it's okay. Okay, I think, is it cool? Are we okay with time? Yeah?
Yeah.
Or another minute?
Maybe another.
Okay. Sorry guys, I'm a bit nervous about not keeping you over. So what does that mean? So if we're starting to, if the role of society and peers is important to us, that might adjust how we present ourselves to the world. So an example of this would be, some people can start to narrow their focus. We talked about narrowing our brain to start to define themselves in very specific ways. And we saw this during the pandemic. So for example, when we had somebody who played like high-level soccer or high-level hockey or was a dancer, when they lost that, a lot of the teens that we work with were like, who am I if I'm not that? Right? So thinking about how we define ourselves through very rigid sort of definitions. And also the other thing that you'll see here is sometimes you can have people who are social chameleons. Like, do you know anybody who might be very different with one friend group, and then is different with another friend group, is very different with your family, is very different with your teachers? That is because you're still trying to figure out who you are as an identity. And one of the things that I urge when I talk to my clients is try to make sure that there's some consistency about who you are and what you stand for across all of those scenarios. Yeah? We're good? Okay, good guys. We'll take a break and you have to come back after lunch. Or else. How are you?
Nice to see you.
See you. How
welcome.
you been?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Are you still guidance?
Yes, yes.
Totally
yes.
different team though.
Totally different. Yeah. We have Magdalena Bitondo and Sue Prada with me this year. Yeah.
How's,
but it's
how's everything?